Have you ever wondered why some people can slice you out of their lives with one sentence but never expect you to actually go? That was the day everything shifted. The living room was dim, late afternoon light casting long stripes across the beige carpet, and her voice, sharp, cold, deliberate, cut through the air like glass breaking. "Stay out of our lives," she said, every syllable measured as if she had rehearsed it in the mirror. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The venom was in the precision. Most people would have argued, begged for clarity, demanded the reasons, but he didn't. He stood there, a still figure against the doorway, absorbing the words like a man memorizing the sound of a door locking behind him. You think walking away is easy. It isn't. It's an art. And he mastered it in that moment, not with fury, but with an eerie kind of calm. The kind that unsettles everyone in the room because it's not the reaction they expect. She thought she was punishing him. She didn't know she was setting him free. The house smelled faintly of laundry detergent and last night's overcooked stew. In the corner, a photo frame tilted slightly forward, frozen smiles from a family gathering that had felt fake even then. His last name carved in wood above the mantel wasn't just decoration, it was legacy. Generations had carried it like a crown or a chain, depending on who you asked. And now, in the space between her sentence and his silence, he knew exactly what he would take with him when he left. Not the couch, not the photos, not the meaningless heirlooms. He would take the name. You don't think much about your name until someone assumes they own it. Until it's tied to a history you're no longer welcome to write. They thought they could erase him by cutting him out, but you can't erase what you can't touch. She was still talking, her mouth moving, her eyes flicking to the children in the room as if recruiting witnesses. He didn't catch every word. It didn't matter. They were filler, justifying a verdict already passed. Across from her, one of the kids looked down at his hands as if ashamed for something that wasn't his doing. That's when he realized this wasn't just exile. This was theater. She wanted the children to see him small. But here's the thing. The quietest exits echo the loudest. He stepped forward, not toward her, but toward the coat rack, slid his jacket on slow like a man with all the time in the world. Her words trailed off, unsure now. You ever notice how power shifts when you stop feeding it your reaction? He didn't flinch, didn't explain himself, didn't even glance back at the family crest above the fireplace. That crest would be gone soon enough. Or maybe it would stay a hollow shell while he carried the real thing out the door. Outside, the air was cool, sharp, with the scent of rain on asphalt. He didn't rush to the car. Every step was deliberate. Inside, he could almost hear the silence after the door clicked shut. That was the first cut, the one that bleeds without them noticing until it's too late. The second cut would come later in ways they couldn't predict. Because here's the truth, no one tells you taking the name wasn't about spite. It was about ownership. For years, he had carried the weight of keeping it respectable, honoring it, shielding it from disgrace, while others in that house tarnished it in whispers and behind closed doors. He had been the loyal one, the keeper of history. And loyalty, when unreturned, becomes a form of self-betrayal. He drove without music, the hum of the engine steady beneath the storm building in his chest. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was the dawning clarity that comes when you finally stop hoping for an apology that will never come. They had told him to stay out. Fine. But they had forgotten the fine print he was taking his legacy with him. They could keep the walls, the dinner table, the performative holidays. He would keep the name, the meaning, the dignity that went with it. You might think that sounds petty, but tell me, if someone told you that you no longer belonged, would you leave them the very thing that tied you together? Would you leave them the story you helped write? Or would you like him walk away with the ink still in your hand? The first night alone was quiet, not peaceful yet, but free of the constant hum of judgment that had followed him in that house. He sat at the kitchen table, an old bottle of whiskey in front of him, and scribbled the name on a piece of paper. His name, their name. The difference now was that it was his to define. Outside, the rain began to fall harder, tapping against the window like impatient fingers. Somewhere miles away, she was probably telling the story her way. That was fine. Let her. The truth didn't need to defend itself. The real story, the one that mattered, was just beginning. The rain didn't stop that night. It whispered against the glass until it became the kind of steady rhythm that gets under your skin, the kind that makes you think of everything you've ignored for years. He sat there staring at the single sheet of paper with the family name scrawled across it. His handwriting looked almost foreign to him, strong strokes, sharp edges. This was not the name of the man they thought they had banished. This was the name of the man they had created without realizing it. He remembered the first time he'd been invited into that family. Back then, the name had been a banner of pride, something spoken with reverence. They had welcomed him in with smiles that didn't yet feel rehearsed with talk of us and ours, as though his life before them had been a waiting room. He had taken it seriously, too seriously. You know that feeling when you think you finally arrived somewhere you belong, only to discover it was conditional all along. That was the beginning of the rot. Over the years, small moments had chipped at him, casual dismissals, decisions made without him, corrections in public dressed up as jokes. It always starts with, "You don't understand our ways," or "That's not how we do things here." Those little phrases are like termites. You don't notice the damage until one day the whole structure caves in. And by then you're standing in the ruins wondering if you were foolish or just loyal. That last day, the sentence, "Stay out of our lives," hadn't just been a dismissal. It had been the final stone in a wall they'd been building for years. But here's the twist: walls work both ways. They keep you out, yes, but they also lock the builders in. She thought she was cutting him off. She was confining herself to the same suffocating rooms, the same narrow corridors of control. The next morning he woke up before the sun. The silence was heavy but not hostile. He brewed coffee, letting the bitter steam fill the air, and sat down with a pen again. This time he wrote the name slowly, deliberately, like engraving it into stone. Then he began drafting letters, official ones, legal ones, documents that would ensure the name was his alone. Not to spite them. No, this was reclamation. This was removing the name from the petty dramas, from the whispered insults at family dinners, from the lies told to protect reputations that didn't deserve saving. You think paperwork is cold? It isn't. In the right hands, it's a weapon, a quiet one, the kind you wield with a steady hand while the other side still thinks they've won. By the time the sun rose, he had a plan. He wasn't just taking the name, he was taking the story. Every achievement he'd tied to it, every business deal, every award, every scrap of hard-earned respect would now be associated with him alone. Without him, the name they kept would be a shell, an empty echo of what it once meant. Days turned into weeks, and the silence from them was deafening. No calls, no messages. But he knew better than to mistake that for indifference. People like that don't let go quietly. They simmer, they plot. They wait for you to slip so they can say, "See, we were right to push him out." What they didn't realize was that he had no intention of slipping. He was building something bigger than the cramped legacy they'd tried to keep him in. And yet, late at night, there were moments. Memories that came uninvited. The way the youngest would run to him with a drawing. The rare times when laughter had been genuine, not staged for appearances. Those moments hurt. They were proof that it hadn't all been poison. That's the cruel part you don't get to walk away with, only the bad. The good comes with you too, like photographs you can't burn even when you want to. But pain can be useful if you let it. It sharpens you. It teaches you where the soft spots are so you can protect them next time. That's what he was learning in the quiet, that strength isn't loud. It's not about shouting your innocence or proving your worth to people who've already decided against you. It's about standing so still they start to wonder if maybe they miscalculated. One night, weeks later, he got word through someone on the fringe of the family. A wedding was coming up. His name, his real legal name, was on the guest list, but not attached to him. They were trying to pass it off as if nothing had changed, as if he'd never claimed it as his own. It was almost funny. Almost. He didn't call to correct them. He didn't send a warning. Instead, he made arrangements of his own. Not to crash the event, no, that would have been too obvious. He preferred something quieter, a reminder. A whisper in the right ear at the right moment. You ever seen someone's face when they realize the ground under them has shifted and they can't trace when it happened? That's the expression he wanted. Not revenge, just reality delivered without ceremony. The rain had stopped by then, but the air still carried that electric charge like something was about to break. The day of the wedding arrived with that peculiar stillness that feels like the world is holding its breath. The kind of stillness before a storm, though the sky was a soft, deceptive blue. He wasn't invited, not truly, but his name was there, printed in looping gold letters on the program. Not his presence, just his legacy, his reputation, his history. They wanted the prestige without the person, a hollow crown. He pictured the scene as he sat in his own kitchen miles away her, in that controlled smile she wore like armor. The relatives leaning in, rehearsing their laughter for photos. the whispers behind napkin-covered mouths about why he wasn't there. They'd have their version ready. He's busy. We're not on speaking terms. It's complicated. Lies lacquered in respectability. But they hadn't accounted for the quiet message that would arrive before dessert. He had contacted the venue weeks earlier not to disrupt but to correct. A simple, polite letter, formal, dignified, explaining that the family name on the seating charts and place cards now belonged to him alone. It was legally his and could not be used without his permission. No drama, no accusations, just a fact delivered with the weight of official letterhead. The manager had been apologetic, almost embarrassed. He assured him the matter would be handled discreetly. And so, in the middle of that glossy reception, someone from the staff would be moving quietly from table to table, swapping out place cards, correcting the program, replacing the name with something generic stripped of history. The kind of small, subtle change that no one talks about openly but everyone notices. The kind that leaves a taste in the air for the rest of the evening. Imagine sitting there, champagne in hand, as your guests frown at their menus, confusion flickering across their faces. Imagine having to explain why the crest was gone from the decor, why the name suddenly didn't match the invitations. No accusations, no confrontation, just absence. That's the beauty of absence. It forces people to fill the silence with their own discomfort. While all this unfolded elsewhere, he sat in the dim light of his home sipping black coffee instead of champagne. His phone buzzed twice, short messages from people who noticed. What happened? They seem rattled. He didn't reply. That wasn't the point. This wasn't about gloating or parading a victory. This was about balance, about showing that exile works both ways. They had cut him out of their lives. He had cut them off from the very name they clung to. You might call it petty. But tell me, if someone tried to keep your name while erasing you from the story, would you let them? Or would you, as he did, remind them that your silence is not weakness but choice? In the days after, there was no direct contact, no apology, but the tone shifted. The mutual acquaintances they still shared spoke more carefully now, as though they were aware of some invisible line they might cross. Power had moved quietly, and no one wanted to be on the wrong side of it. Still, there were moments in the night when he thought about the children. Not with regret he had made peace with what was lost, but with a quiet wondering about what they'd been told. He knew children grow up, and when they do, they start asking their own questions. Questions that can't be answered with half-truths and staged photographs. When that day came, he would be ready, not with bitterness, but with the kind of steady, undeniable truth that doesn't need embellishment. Weeks turned into months. The family went back to their curated lives, pretending the fracture wasn't there, but fractures don't heal when you hide them under paint. And the more they tried to act untouched, the more their movements revealed the cracks. You could see it in the way their smiles never quite reached their eyes, the way they avoided certain topics in public. That's the thing about truth. It leaks no matter how tightly you think you've sealed it. He didn't watch them closely anymore. That was the other shift detachment. True detachment isn't pretending you don't care. It's knowing you could look, you could intervene, but you choose not to. He had taken what was his and left the rest. The name, the dignity, the freedom. They could keep their politics, their small circles of control, their endless performances for the neighbors. But every so often he'd pass by a shop window and see his reflection catch the faintest smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, not from triumph, from knowing that the man who had once stood silent in their living room absorbing their verdict without protest had walked away whole. And in the end, that was the truest victory, carrying himself and his name beyond the reach of their grasping hands. The rain returned that night, gentle at first, then heavier, as if washing the last of the residue from the air. Somewhere in the distance he imagined the house where it had all begun, its lights glowing behind drawn curtains. A place that had once been the center of his life, now just another landmark he could drive past without stopping. The quiet was complete, and in that quiet he knew he would never go back. Months later, the quiet had become a companion. Not the heavy, suffocating kind that presses in on you, but the kind that opens space in your chest. He'd moved to a smaller place, nothing grand, nothing that would impress anyone still keeping score in that old house, but it was his. The walls held no ghosts, no whispered judgments drifting from room to room, just the steady hum of a life he was building without permission or approval. One morning he found himself at a cafe he used to avoid. It was near their part of town, a place where the family would sometimes gather after church. Back then, he'd sat stiffly at the corner table, smiling when prompted, speaking only when the conversation demanded it. Today, he walked in and ordered without hesitation, choosing a seat by the window where the light poured in like honey. He didn't think about them until he noticed a familiar voice, low, urgent, behind him. It was one of her sisters. She hadn't seen him yet. She was speaking to someone else, but her words were edged with the same clipped precision he remembered. He didn't need to hear the details. He knew the rhythm. This was how they operated, dissecting lives in low tones, assigning blame with surgical skill, all under the guise of concern. He could have turned to greeted her, made it awkward, but that would have given her the satisfaction of knowing she'd been noticed. Instead, he sipped his coffee and let the conversation wash over him like background noise. You ever realize how much power you have when you no longer react? It's like stepping outside a storm and realizing you've been choosing to stand in the rain all these years. When he finally stood to leave, she saw him. There was that flicker in her eyes, a flash of recognition, surprise, and something else she couldn't quite hide. Was it guilt, curiosity? He didn't care. He gave a polite nod, not a smile, and walked past her as if she were no more than a passerby. The nod was intentional. A smile could be misread as an invitation. A nod says, "I see you, that's all." Later in his car, he sat for a moment before starting the engine. It struck him how easy it was now to encounter pieces of the past without being pulled back into it. The hooks were gone. They couldn't reel him in anymore. And the more he thought about it, the more he understood the subtle revenge in that, to live so completely outside their reach that even chance meetings became powerless. A few weeks after, a letter arrived. Not from her, of course, she'd never allow herself that vulnerability, but from one of the older uncles. The handwriting was careful, formal. Inside, the words danced between apology and justification, as though the two could coexist. "It's a shame things have gone the way they have. Families should stay together. Perhaps we all said things we didn't mean." He read it once slowly, then again faster. The subtext was clear. They were feeling the absence. The empty space where his name had been was heavier than they'd expected. Events felt thinner without the weight of his presence, his steady hand on the family's public image. They hadn't wanted him, but they'd wanted what he gave them. Now they were learning the difference. He didn't respond right away. In fact, he waited a month before sending anything back. And when he did, it wasn't a letter. It was a single card, the kind you'd use for a business thank you. Inside, in his even handwriting, he wrote only, "I wish you all the best, truly." No return address, no invitation to continue, just enough to be polite, not enough to reopen the door. You see, the real turning point comes when you no longer need the other side to acknowledge your worth. When their approval or their disapproval becomes irrelevant, that's when you're free. And freedom, he was learning, was addictive. Seasons changed. The air turned colder, then softened again. He grew used to the rhythm of his own life-work dinners with friends who felt like family mornings that began without a knot in his stomach. The name was still his, but it had transformed. It was no longer tied to their expectations or history. It was tied to him alone, to the choices he made each day to protect it. And sometimes late at night he would think about how they might be speaking of him now. Were they still telling the story as if he'd been the one to leave? Or had they begun quietly to admit that maybe they'd pushed too far? He would never know for sure. And that perhaps was the final gift they'd given him, the freedom not to care about the ending of their version. Because here's the truth, some stories you don't need to correct. You just need to outlive them. And he was doing exactly that. Spring arrived like a slow exhale, the air carrying that faint sweetness of things beginning again. By now the distance between him and the family wasn't measured in miles, but in silence. And silence, he had learned, is not emptiness, it's space. Space to breathe, to choose to rebuild without their shadows stretching over him. He had stopped looking over his shoulder for their reactions. There was no more counting days since the last word exchanged, no more wondering if a message might arrive. The his name was no longer a reminder of what he'd left. It had become the banner over everything he was creating. His business cards carried it now. The small company he'd started was gaining traction not because of the family's reputation, but in spite of it. One afternoon, an email came from a local historical society. They were compiling a piece on the legacy of certain prominent family names in the region. They wanted to feature him, not them. The irony wasn't lost on him. For decades, they'd clung to the idea that their name was the crown jewel, something outsiders could only borrow. And now here was proof that the shine they had was the one he had given it. He agreed to the interview, but on one condition: the story would focus on his work, his achievements, and his values, not the old house or the people still inside it. The journalist was intrigued. She asked questions he hadn't heard in years about his beginnings, his challenges, the philosophy that guided him. And as he answered, he realized he was telling the story of the name without once mentioning the family. You ever notice how the past starts to shrink when you stop feeding it? How something that once loomed like a mountain becomes just another shape on the horizon? That's what was happening now. The drama that had felt like the axis of his life was just a chapter. A necessary one, but not the whole book. Of course, word got back to them. The article went live, complete with a photo of him in front of his office, the name on the glass door behind him. It wasn't a confrontation, it was a declaration. The name had moved on. And so had he. He didn't need to hear their reactions to know it stung. People like that aren't angered by insults, they're angered by irrelevance. A week later, he was walking through the Saturday market when he saw her. Not the sister this time, her. The one who had stood in the living room all those months ago, voice cold, telling him to stay out of their lives. She was at a stall examining fruit, wearing sunglasses, even though the morning was overcast. For a moment their eyes met. Just a moment. He saw the flicker recognition calculation, maybe even a trace of regret, but she didn't move toward him, and neither did he. They just stood there, two people who had once shared a life's worth of rooms and words, now separated by nothing but air and choices. It would have been so easy to break the silence, to say something polite or cutting or both, to reopen the wound, but easy wasn't his goal anymore. Instead, he gave her the same nod he'd given her sister in the cafe. Not an invitation, not a truce, just acknowledgement that she existed and that her existence no longer dictated his own. He walked away first. That mattered. Not because he needed the upper hand, but because he refused to stand still in a place that would pull him backward. Every step he took was towards something new, something entirely his. That night, sitting by the window with a glass of wine, he thought about how strange it was the way the final victory often doesn't feel like victory at all. It feels like peace. Not the thunderclap of revenge, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing you've built a life beyond their reach. They could keep their gatherings, their politics, their silent competitions over who sat where at the table. He would keep his mornings, his work, his freedom. The balance was perfect. Because in the end, the most devastating thing you can do to people who expect your devotion is to show them you never needed them to begin with. And he was done showing, he was simply living. Summer heat came early that year, heavy and slow, pressing against the windows like it wanted in. By then his life had shape, not the shape they'd tried to force him into rigid ornamental, but something fluid, something that moved with him instead of against him. The name had become a vessel for new meaning, a thread running through contracts, invoices, and small victories that had nothing to do with the family's crumbling prestige. One afternoon, while sorting through his mail, he found a thick cream-colored envelope. No return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Hers. The script was as deliberate as her voice had been that day, controlled no loops or flourishes, every letter perfectly upright. He turned it over in his hands, weighing whether to open it. He could have thrown it out. He could have sent it back unopened, but curiosity clean, not desperate won. Inside was a letter that tried to balance two impossible things, pride and invitation. She wrote of past misunderstandings, of wanting to put certain things behind us. She mentioned the children, now older, who asked about him. There was no apology, not really. Only the suggestion that perhaps they might meet for lunch. Neutral ground. You've been here before, haven't you? That moment where the door you closed is cracked open again just wide enough for the light to tempt you. But you know that light. You've felt its warmth and its burn. He set the letter down and walked away from it. Not in anger, not even in caution. Just with the understanding that some invitations are traps without malice pits dug by habit and history. And the most dangerous thing you can do is mistake them for bridges. For days he didn't respond. He let the letter sit on his desk like a test he had no intention of taking. In that silence, he noticed something important. He didn't feel torn. The pull toward them was gone. Whatever longing there had been for recognition, for some version of belonging, had evaporated in the life he'd built. Instead, he thought about the children, not as pawns in her letter, but as people growing into their own lives. He wondered if they'd ever reach out on their own without her voice in their ear. If they did, he knew he'd meet them as himself, not as the role he'd been assigned in her house. A week later, he sent a reply. Short, respectful final. I appreciate your message. I'm glad to hear the children are well. At this time, I'm focused on my own path and won't be able to meet. I wish you peace. He didn't explain. He didn't soften it with future promises. Sometimes clarity is the kindest thing you can offer, even when it's the least comforting. Months passed. His business grew. His circle widened. The name once the chain they'd tried to wrap around him had become a banner under which others now gathered. He noticed how people said it with pride, how it carried no weight from the old house anymore. It belonged to the present, not the past. And then one autumn evening he heard the news. The family home, the stage for all their performances, was being sold. The story went that upkeep had become too much, the walls too old, the roof too stubborn to repair. He imagined the rooms stripped bare, the echo of footsteps on floors that had once been carpeted in ceremony. The mantel without the crest. The dining table without its hierarchy. He didn't feel triumph. What he felt was distance. That house had been the fortress they used to keep him small, and now it was dissolving into someone else's possession. What remained of it would belong to strangers, and maybe that was right. Maybe it was the only way to bury a place like that, let it become a story told by people with no stake in its ghosts. That night, as he locked up his office, he caught his reflection in the glass door. The name gleamed behind him, etched in clean lines. His name, not theirs, not anymore. The woman who knows her worth doesn't beg, she watches. Then she rises.